intern, Reed Grainer.
How many of you have worked as an intern in any field? Few of you have. Good evening, fellow Toastmasters. Welcome to our guests. I had 2 internships when I was getting my master's degree in social work. The place, the University of Utah, at least that's what the gymnasts did in their routines. The Salt Lake City, the time, the early 90s, 1990 through 1992. I started my second-year internship the fall of 1991. I worked in a hospital in West Salt Lake City, Utah. I remember one day I was called to go to the emergency room to deal with a case that I had very little information about, which is very common in social work. I just knew a few things. I knew it involved a 3-year-old boy who had come in via ambulance on a gurney and was on the gurney in the emergency room. His mother, a school teacher, had been called to come into the emergency room, and apparently he had fallen off a bunk bed. This was 25 years ago. So a quarter of a century later, I can't remember every detail and how it flowed to the next. Hold my calls, please. I do remember his mother showing up to the ER, understandably frantic. I mean, she ran in. She was very young, 23, 24, pregnant. She had some conversation with medical staff. At that point, what I remember her doing was sort of pacing around the gurney, shaking her head, as if to say no, no, no. And then she shifted modes, and she talked to her son and said, "Come on, Gavin, we're going to go to McDonald's. Let's go. Come on, we're going to McDonald's. Get up, we're going to McDonald's." At which point she laid her hand on his body and she screamed. Why did she scream? What did she feel? Cold. The next thing I remember is that we were shuffled into a very small conference room, really tiny, and I was standing by the door, and the 2 guys that were training me were standing right by me, and the young mother was sitting there, and understandably it hadn't set in yet. I think as human beings we only can digest so much at once. There were a couple of nurses there to support her, and in came a woman in a long white coat, a pediatrician, who had to do her job. And she looked at the young mother and she said, "Gavin is dead." At that point, I heard something I've never forgotten, and that was this young mother's horror and pain and shock escape her body in the form of a scream. And in the last 25 years, I have never heard anything like that. The next thing that happened was in the state of Utah at the time, there was and may still be a law that under such circumstances, someone has to address the issue of organ donation. Organ donation. And guess who was saddled with that task? The intern. And thank goodness for one of my friends in grad school told me this type of thing might come up at some point. And she told me to address it in the form of a question. So I turned to the young mother and I said, "Do you have any questions about organ donation?" At which point, understandably, she screamed again. By this time, her mother was there and said, It makes sense that they're asking this. I understood why I had to ask that question, and I did it because it was the law, but I hated asking that question. It was a horrible question to ask. At that point, I then had to call his grandparents on the East Coast and inform them what had happened. And the conversation went something like this. Hello, my name is Reed. I'm a social work intern. There's been an accident. Your grandson, Gavin, is dead. At that juncture, I thought, welcome to the wonderful world of social work. If you remember the early 1990s, there was no internet, no iPads, no cell phones. What we did have were those old antiquated items called newspapers. Does anyone remember those? The long sheets of paper with printed ink. I think it had something to do with the Gutenberg press somewhere down the line. You could get ink on your fingers by looking at them. I was looking at one a few weeks after this incident, and I read an article that I knew was about this little boy, even though it didn't mention the name. What I learned from that article was the ME, do you know what ME is?
Medical examiner.
Medical examiner determined that this little boy's head injury was not consistent with a fall.
Mm-hmm.
What was it consistent with?
Abuse.
Blunt force trauma to the head. And the only two people at home at the time were the little boy and his father. And the father was going to be tried for murder.
Wow.
At that point, I couldn't hear anymore. I didn't want to hear anymore. I had no need to. What I needed to do was done. And it took me a few weeks to unravel myself just from that one experience. That is an experience that I will never forget as the intern, as long as I have a brain with which to remember